Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that a conflict between two countries, thousands of kilometers apart, could affect the price of fuel, international trade, air travel, and even the global economy. That is the reality of the war between the United States and Iran. But this war did not simply begin overnight. To understand why America and Iran are fighting, we have to go back decades to a story involving oil, revolution, hostages, nuclear technology, sanctions, assassinations, and years of military tension. And in 2026, that long history finally exploded into a direct and much larger war. So how did America and Iran get here? Let's go back to the beginning. Our story starts in 1953. At that time, Iran was ruled by a monarchy, but the country's prime minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, had taken a major step that angered Britain and affected Western interests. He nationalized Iran's oil industry, which had previously been heavily controlled by a British company. Britain responded with economic pressure, and eventually American and British intelligence helped Iranian forces overthrow Mossadegh. The Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, became increasingly powerful and remained a close American ally. For Washington, Iran was an important partner in the Middle East, but inside Iran, many people viewed the Shah's government as authoritarian and believed the United States had too much influence over their country. This resentment continued for years, and then, in 1979, everything changed. A massive revolution brought down the Shah. Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini returned from exile and became the leading figure of the new Islamic Republic. Iran went from being a close American partner to one of America's strongest opponents. And then came the event that permanently changed relations between the two countries. The American embassy in Tehran was seized. Dozens of American diplomats and citizens were taken hostage and held for more than a year. The crisis lasted 444 days. The United States and Iran broke diplomatic relations, and since then, they have never restored normal diplomatic relations. In simple terms, imagine two neighbors who once did business together. One day, their relationship completely collapses. They stop talking. They stop trading. And for decades, every disagreement becomes another reason to distrust each other. That is roughly what happened between Washington and Tehran. But the hostility did not remain limited to words. During the 1980s, the two countries became involved in a series of confrontations across the Middle East and the Persian Gulf. The United States accused Iran of supporting armed groups and attacks against American interests. Iran, meanwhile, viewed the United States as a powerful foreign force attempting to dominate the region. Then another issue became increasingly important: Iran's nuclear program. Interestingly, the nuclear story has a surprising beginning. Before the Iranian Revolution, the United States actually supported Iran's civilian nuclear ambitions. Iran joined the International Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and during the Shah's rule, America helped Iran develop nuclear technology for peaceful purposes. But after the 1979 revolution, the relationship completely changed. Over the following decades, Iran expanded its nuclear activities. The United States and several other countries became increasingly concerned that Iran could eventually develop the ability to produce nuclear weapons. Iran repeatedly said its nuclear program was for peaceful purposes, and this disagreement became one of the central issues between Washington and Tehran. By the 2000s, sanctions against Iran were becoming increasingly severe. The goal was to put economic pressure on Tehran and force restrictions on its nuclear activities. But sanctions also affected ordinary people and Iran's economy. Then, in 2015, something unexpected happened. Iran and several world powers reached the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, commonly known as the Iran nuclear deal. Iran agreed to limits and monitoring of its nuclear program in exchange for sanctions relief. For a moment, it looked as if diplomacy might finally succeed. But the agreement did not last. In 2018, President Donald Trump withdrew the United States from the nuclear agreement and restored American sanctions against Iran. Iran subsequently reduced its compliance with several of the agreement's limits. The relationship became hostile again. Then came one of the most dangerous moments. In January 2020, the United States killed Qasem Soleimani, a senior Iranian military commander, in a drone strike near Baghdad. Iran responded by launching missiles at bases hosting American forces in Iraq. The world watched nervously because a much larger war seemed possible. But the situation did not immediately turn into a full-scale war. For several more years, the United States and Iran continued a dangerous pattern: sanctions, proxy conflicts, missile attacks, drone attacks, cyber operations, and military confrontations across the Middle East. Then the regional situation became even more complicated after the Hamas-led attack on Israel in October 2023 and the war that followed. Iran supported several armed groups in the region, while the United States strongly supported Israel and increased its military presence in the Middle East. Attacks involving Iranian-backed groups increasingly targeted American forces and regional allies. The United States responded with strikes against Iranian-backed groups. The two countries were still not officially declaring a traditional war against each other, but they were getting closer and closer to direct confrontation. And then came 2026. According to reporting from Reuters and other major outlets, the current war began on February 28, 2026, when Israel and the United States launched major strikes against Iran. The attacks targeted Iranian military and strategic facilities. Iran responded with missiles and other attacks against American and regional targets. What had previously been a decades-long shadow conflict had now become an open military confrontation. And this is where the story becomes much bigger than just America and Iran, because geography matters. Iran sits next to the Strait of Hormuz. This narrow waterway connects the Persian Gulf with the Gulf of Oman and is one of the world's most important routes for energy shipments. Think of it like a major highway for global oil and gas. If that highway is disrupted, the consequences can travel far beyond the Middle East. Ships can be delayed. Insurance costs can rise. Oil prices can increase. And eventually, higher energy costs can affect transportation, factories, businesses, and ordinary consumers around the world. Iran has used its strategic position around the Strait of Hormuz as a major source of leverage. The United States, meanwhile, has deployed naval and air forces in the region and has argued that international shipping routes must remain open. This created another dangerous cycle. Iran attacks or threatens American and allied interests. The United States responds with military strikes. Iran retaliates. America responds again. And every round creates pressure for the next round. By the middle of 2026, the conflict had already spread far beyond the original battlefield. Iran launched attacks against American military positions and targets in the region. The United States conducted additional strikes inside Iran. Other countries became involved directly or indirectly. Shipping routes were threatened. Regional armed groups became more assertive, and diplomacy struggled to stop the fighting. There was even an interim ceasefire arrangement in June, but the agreement quickly collapsed after the two sides disagreed over its terms, including the status of the Strait of Hormuz and other issues. By August 2026, fighting and military pressure were still continuing. The United States had imposed a naval blockade around Iranian ports, while Iran maintained that it controlled access through the Strait of Hormuz. Both sides continued making competing claims about the situation, and diplomatic efforts were facing serious obstacles. But here's the most important point. There isn't one single reason for this war. It is the result of decades of accumulated distrust. For Iran, the story includes foreign interference, the 1953 coup, American support for the Shah, sanctions, military pressure, and what Tehran sees as attempts to weaken or isolate the Islamic Republic. For the United States, the story includes the 1979 hostage crisis, attacks linked to Iranian-backed groups, Iran's missile and nuclear programs, and concerns about Iran's growing influence across the Middle East. Both sides have their own version of the story, and both sides believe they are responding to threats created by the other. That is what makes this conflict so difficult to stop. Imagine two people standing on opposite sides of a room. One person says, "I'm holding a weapon because you might attack me." The other answers, "I'm holding mine because you are holding yours." Neither side wants to put the weapon down first. That is the security dilemma at the heart of many international conflicts, And the America-Iran confrontation is an extreme example. The consequences are also much larger than the two countries themselves. The conflict can affect oil markets, shipping, regional governments, international alliances, and millions of civilians. It can also create new tensions between America and countries that support Iran, while increasing pressure on America's allies in the Middle East. And there is another major question. Can the war actually produce a winner? Military power can destroy weapons, bases, infrastructure, and military facilities. But military power alone does not automatically solve political disagreements. The United States has enormous military capabilities. Iran has a large population, a huge territory, missile forces, regional partnerships, and the ability to make any prolonged conflict extremely expensive. That means even if one side wins individual battles, the larger political conflict may continue. And that is why diplomacy remains so important. Because eventually, wars usually end, not when one side destroys everything the other side has, but when both sides decide that continuing the fight costs more than reaching an agreement. The United States and Iran have already demonstrated that diplomacy is possible. The 2015 nuclear agreement proved that negotiations can produce complicated compromises even between bitter rivals. The problem is trust. After decades of broken agreements, sanctions, attacks, assassinations, and retaliation, each side has reasons to doubt the other's promises. So the biggest question isn't simply, who is stronger, America or Iran? The bigger question is, can these two countries find a way to stop the cycle? Because the history of America and Iran shows us something important. Wars rarely begin with a single event. Sometimes they begin decades earlier, with political decisions, economic pressure, revolutions, broken relationships, and unresolved fears. Then one crisis becomes another, and eventually, the accumulated tension reaches a point where diplomacy fails and missiles begin flying. The current America-Iran war is the result of that long chain of events, and how it ends could shape the Middle East and possibly the global economy for years to come. If you found this explanation useful, subscribe for more original history, geopolitics, and documentary-style stories explained in simple language. And remember, to understand today's wars, sometimes you have to go back decades to understand where the story really began.